Well, welcome to Trauma, its Impact and Implications for Recovery. This is a continuation of the previous lecture on joy and joy strength. My name is Dr. Jim Wilder, and I work as a ordained minister and a licensed psychologist at a counseling center in Van Nuys, California called Shepherd's House, where we have been working for about 29 years as a staff, and for at least the last 15 years we have focused on the areas of severe trauma related particularly to sexual abuse, early childhood abuse. And during that time we were the first Christian counseling center in the area to deal with the area of child abuse victims as adults. And so we worked in that particular area for quite a few years now. Since we were the only counseling center doing it, we had over 200 churches referring to us, the people from their churches that had incest or sexual abuse in childhood. And so if you get 200 churches, you realize that what happens is that the pastor will counsel those that he can counsel, and then those he can't, he refers to the counselors within that church. And the people who prove to be too difficult somehow to handle within that context get sent on to some other center. And at that center, they get funneled to our center because we were the only one working on the issue. So we had, at one period in time, we were seeing over 1,200 appointments a month, the majority of them being for some kind of incest or sexual abuse. We were, in fact, at that point in time, the busiest counseling center in the San Fernando Valley of Los Angeles. And we were seeing all people dealing with this kind of severe trauma. Not surprising that out of that cluster, we ended up with a lot of people with what was called at that time multiple personality disorder, now called dissociative identity disorder. And as a result of having so many of them, I think the average person at our center, and at that time we had a team of about 12 people working on dissociative disorders, was seeing 5 to 15 people with dissociative disorders of one sort or another. From that bunch, the worst cases were sent to me because of two factors. One is I was one of the most trained people on staff. I had the more degrees behind my name. And so when other people felt that the case had gotten too difficult for them, they would send it on to me. Now, most of the counseling at that time, since most of the sexual abuse cases were women, was being done by women, because it's considered that women should counsel women for sexual abuse issues. But some of the cases, the women said, this person is in such bad shape that it really doesn't matter anymore whether they see a man or a woman, and they sent them on to me. So you'd see I'm at the very small end of a very large funnel. You start with those 200 churches, and you narrow it down to the worst cases that even our staff couldn't handle being passed on to me. The second reason that it was passed on to me is very interesting, to me at least, and that is because of my experience as a missionary kid. I grew up in South America during a time of violence and persecution. During the first 10 years of my life, there were approximately 250,000 people murdered in the area where I live. And so we were familiar with violence, persecution, and a real outpouring of evil. And the one thing that taught me was that God is able. And so, for whatever reasons, this unsinkable faith that God had prepared me for said that whatever He has sent these people to me about, though I might not understand what's going on with them and what's being done, for some reason God has me here. And whatever He wants to do by having me here will be accomplished. And the second thing that I realized was from growing up in a church under that kind of persecution was that none of them were trained. None of them were, most of them couldn't read, but they were able to somehow be the body of Christ to each other. And so I knew that somehow in the middle of being the body of the Christ to people who have been through some of the most awful experiences in the world, there is the possibility of becoming who God meant you to be. Well, that's a good place to start for me. And so as a result of that, we began to look very seriously at trauma. And it's out of that context that much of what we're talking about here is developed. Very nice to work with a staff of people, because although I would estimate that probably each one on staff in the first 2 years that we began working with this probably invested at least 1,500, probably closer to 2,000 of hours of studying individually on this subject. If you put together 8 or 10 people studying 2,000 hours within that amount of time, going through all the literature, all the information, all the scripture, all the tapes, all the conferences, you can get a lot of things also funneled down to one point in time of all that's been known and seen and learned. And what we discovered was that the best secular solutions, surprise, surprise, were not producing real healing and change in people's lives. At best, they were maintaining where people were, keeping them from getting worse, and one of the largest secular authorities on the subject of dissociative disorders declared that the condition really was untreatable, in the sense that you couldn't really achieve a change. You could at best kind of contain this mess in a little way. Well, it wouldn't be too surprising to you after listening to the first lecture if you came to realize that the people who were sent to me were not only the people who had been traumatized very badly, but the people who had also failed to bond or attach to anybody in their lives. And so I began to be the person who was at the center of a lot of unbonded, unattached, very, very traumatized people. It gave in me that intense desire to know what was the way out of this. And so, in that context, the deep passion to understand what we're talking about was born inside of me. Some of you, I sense and know from your conversations, have walked some kind of similar path than this. You may not have been at quite as close to the center of the funnel as I got placed, and so I'm giving you the perspective from where it was really pretty intense, in the hopes that you might be able to gather the results of these thousands of hours of facing suffering and somehow benefit from what we experienced there. We had a psychiatrist consult with us, and he said that the average case at Shepherd's House was worse than the worst case in any other place that he had consulted with in Los Angeles. And since Los Angeles is already a pretty weird part of the world, this is, I thought, saying something. So what have we learned about trauma and recovery there? Well, one of the things that we discovered was that trauma has an effect on memory. And because the whole conflict over memory is so closely tied to the discussion of trauma, we need to start with that. Memory, as you might guess, is actually related to the brain and its functions. There's a physical component, very strong physical aspect to memory. So we can't discuss memory without talking about the brain somewhat. Memory is remembering who we are so that we can act like ourselves in the future. I believe that's the purpose for memory. It's a record of who we are so that we can act like ourselves in the future. And so to the degree that our memory is distorted by lies about ourselves, we do not act like ourselves in the future. To the degree that information about us is missing, we are unable to act like ourselves in the future because we do not have a statement, any kind of image of who we are. But lest we think that memory is a unitary phenomenon, that there's only one kind of memory, we need to start by looking at what actually is going on as a neurological level when we talk about memory. It is actually easier to say that there are a lot of different kinds of memory that take place within our nervous system. There's only one of them that we typically think of as memory. The typical one means what we would call as sort of a intentionally recalled autobiographical kind of memory. That is, I think back and I remember something about my life. I can remember that there was a break here earlier and I talked to some people and we did things like that. And I think of that because I'm intentionally trying to remember that. And so that is an explicit memory. It's a memory that I pull back because I want to, and now that I don't want to think about that, I'm going to forget about it for the rest of the lecture. However, I had a nice drink of lemonade right there, and in order to drink that lemonade, my mind also had to remember a whole lot of things about how to hold a glass, how to stand while I'm drinking, how to swallow, all of those kinds of functions, none of which I can recall where I got it from. But unless I had remembered that, I would have not only spilled a drink over myself, if I was fortunate, but I would have probably fallen right on my rear end while trying to do so. And so personally, I'm very satisfied with that part of my memory, even though I can't recall where it came from. And that's an implicit memory. It is retrieved by my body's request without any conscious knowledge of where it came from. And as far as I know, I wasn't remembering how to hold that glass, I was just holding the glass. There's no differentiation between the experience now and the memory from the past. Well, these different kinds, those are the two simplest kinds of memories that we're going to talk about. And the brain has many other kinds of memories that we could talk about. There's short-term memory, long-term memory, intermediate kinds of permanent of memory. There's permanent memory. All of those kinds of real technical details which are sort of irrelevant to most of us unless we're actually in an accident or something that disrupts that. But we want to talk about the memory process starting with the most technical part of all, and that is how information is processed by the brain. Well, in order to make this tolerable, I've had to come up with an analogy that helps me think about it. The information that comes into your brain that might need it. Central receiving is what basically notifies the rest of your brain, we got some information for you here and we're sending it on. Central receiving will take information from either inside your body, like it'll tell me where my knees and legs and stuff like that are right now, so that as I'm standing and waving my arms, I am not losing balance or losing track of where I am or smacking the microphone or something like that. It's saying your arm, I'm getting information from your arm, from your knee, all that sort of stuff. I'm not paying much attention to it really consciously, but central receiving is taking care of that. It's also taking care of the information that I'm receiving from you out there and looking at my notes when that comes along. And it tells my brain there's information coming in you need to pay attention to. From there, the information is sent to the amygdala, which I call the guard shack. So it looks over the information coming in and says, it's okay, or wait a minute, I think I see a gun, or what it's looking for the most is an angry face. Because the worst information as far as your amygdala is concerned is someone's mad at me. That's the scariest thing, an angry human being. And there's little doubt about it if we think about it, that probably the most dangerous thing any of us is going to encounter is going to be an angry human being. Where probably the amygdala would be well placed to be alarmed by that. Next to it are things like snakes. Sees a snake, the amygdala tends to have a very strong reaction to snakes, not like them. There's some indication it may even be born with a reaction to already identify snakes without having ever seen one before. And it certainly is alarmed by what they call a visual cliff, or something that looks like right in front of me there's something that's a long ways down. And some of you may have gone to the edge of a building and looked down, and your amygdala went, whoa, that was close. This is a long way down. We don't like that. That's built into you. Your amygdala doesn't like that. And the guard shack says, I got information coming here that's scary. And there's a lot of things that can be there. Well, the guard shack has had a look at the information. It passes it along to the hippocampus, which is really your brain's library. see a brown crooked thing on the ground. And I look at that and my brain says, brown crooked thing on the ground, what could it be? And the library starts looking up under brown crooked things. Now, if it happens to pull a file on snake, I'm going to be jumping because, you know, and part of whether I'll look it up under snake depends on whether the guard shack sent this along with a sign that says, dangerous information coming up. Then almost certainly, if it came in with dangerous information signal with it from the guard shack, look out, and I see brown crooked thing, I'm going to go snake. Look up under snake. What have I got under snake? But if it came in without an alarm signal, then my brain is going to look under brown crooked things. It might say, yeah, long brown crooked thing, the stick's going out a different way. Ah, it's a stick laying on the ground. And what do I know about sticks? Well, they don't bite you, they don't hurt you, unless they're falling on your head, no particular problem here. And they will send, the library then will send this information on to the anterior cingulate. Now, the anterior cingulate is the head librarian. And say, well, we've got this experience, this is what we think about sticks. We actually find them very useful for whacking dogs. And over here we find about sticks that we have feelings of sort of general indifference to that, because although you can use them for whacking dogs, there's no dogs around, we just don't really care. So here's the information, there's a stick out there we don't really care about. You could use it to whack a dog if you wanted to, but you know, it's really not advised. So the head librarian combines all of those thoughts together. Now, when they've done that, they send it to your prefrontal cortex. The question is asked, what is it like me to do with this information? And I say, well, I have a stick out there, I don't care much about it, it's useful for whacking dogs, but it's not like me to whack dogs, I like dogs. They're my pets, why would I want to do that with it? So I'm going to leave the stick on the ground, we're going to go off someplace else and do something, because what it's like me to do is keep walking and ignore that stick. If, on the other hand, I happen to have a use for a stick right then, said, oh, that could also be useful for walking as a walking stick, and that one looks about the right length, I think it would be like me to pick it up and walk. So we have the information processing through the brain in that order. Sort of unremarkable when you think about it. Comes into central receiving, sends to the guard shack for alarms. They send it to the library to look it up. The librarian, the head librarian gets it then and says, how do we think and feel about this together? Hands it on to you. And here for the first time, with all this information coming in, you get to say, and what would it be like me to do with this information? Well, the information that it looks up in terms of how I feel about the situation and what I think about it is located primarily in different hemispheres of the brain. So if we look in the right hemisphere, we get the information about how I feel about it, my sensory experience of the information that's coming in. Right hemispheric memory. So when I picked up this cup and I was remembering what it was like to hold a cup, I have no sense that I'm remembering something. I just feel like I'm holding the cup. And the same thing would happen to you when you're holding your pen and making a note. You feel like I'm just doing this. You're not saying, oh, I'm remembering now when I first picked up a pen. There's no subjective sense of being recalled. It's more exciting, of course, when you trigger the memory without the event going on at the moment. So if you went in there with an electrode, triggered somebody's brain to trigger a right hemispheric memory, they might say, oh, I feel like I'm riding a bicycle, and the wind is blowing through my hair, and I can feel, and I can smell, and these are the memories, I just feel like it's happening now. And they look around, and they say, but I'm not on a bicycle, I can see, but I feel like I'm riding a bicycle. That would be a right hemispheric memory. It's also non-focal, which means, remember the flashlight of a consciousness? It can't be focused on anything. The right hemisphere memory takes in the whole event, not just what I want to focus on. So it would be aware of everything in the room and my body that was going on at this particular time, not just the particular person that I happen to be focusing on consciously. The nice thing about that is that because it's non-focal, it's not There is, to this date, not a shred of evidence or study or anything that indicates that a right hemispheric memory can be suggested to a person or implanted in any way. The right hemisphere simply will not focus, will only take it all in, but you can't make somebody remember something that isn't there. What they'll remember is they'll remember you trying to make them think of something that wasn't there. They take in the whole event. So how are you going to make them? Unless you can focus them to where they ignore you trying to put that memory in there, you know, but as long as they're taking in the whole event, they say, oh, I know where that's coming from. So-and-so is trying to make me think something. So the whole experience is there. Right hemispheric memory has this as a characteristic. So you get trauma recovery. You have someone, if they're having a right hemispheric memory come back to them, they are experiencing as though it's happening right now. They might call it a body memory. My body feels as though it's being raped. I'm having the sensations right now that someone's raping me, but I don't. No, there's no one out here. I open my eyes, but everything about me feels like this is going on. I'm having a memory. It feels immediate. It feels like it's happening right now. And that kind of memory can't be suggested to anybody. That memory circuit simply won't work that way. And it's also not mediated by the library. So seemed to be going on, so it was stored in the right hemisphere away from the library. It's not dependent on your brain's library to retrieve these. Now the brain's library we'll talk about when we talk about the left hemispheric memory. After I want to get exactly that and not something else. It's focal because it's just what I want to pay attention to. It's declarative because I can talk about it. I can say, here's what I want to try and remember, here's what I'm trying to work on, here's what I'm remembering. It comes out of that set of memories in the library that I can talk about. It's conscious. You asked me to remember, what was the break like? I remember the break. I do right now. If you ask me tomorrow, I won't remember it because it probably just will go out of short-term memory and I won't have it there. But I might remember some of the little episodes of people I talked with. Your face comes up and you say, hi, and I say, oh yeah, we talked at the break yesterday. And I'll remember that little episode of it. That's all that I'll pull back. I might not remember what we talked about, and I certainly won't remember your name. Sorry about that, it just goes out. But I'll look on your name tag, so please wear them again tomorrow. Otherwise, I embarrass myself going to, what's your name again? It's very suggestible, this memory. So you can actually say to someone, well, now, when that accident happened, was there a blue car kind of parked over to the side? And they start, blue car to the side. I'm remembering something blue now that you mention it. Yeah. Okay, yeah, I think there was. There was a blue car over there. And if I don't remember it today, it's quite possible that tomorrow when I came back, I'll say to you, no, I didn't remember that blue car yesterday, but last night it came to me. There was a blue car. It was a Chevy Nova parked over there, license plate, blah, 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 blah. Now, there was no car there at all, but it was suggested to you, and that memory in your brain sort of filled in the pieces because it happened to want to create a story about it. So now you have a little episode and a story. This memory is very highly suggestible, and lots of details can be suggested to it. And furthermore, in studies that have been done on the accuracy of memory, there's no difference in accuracy based on certainty. So that if I'm thinking about a left hemispheric memory and I'm just certain that blue car was there, it's not any more likely to be there than if I wasn't certain that the blue car was there. In other words, these focal memories, you can be totally certain that this is what happened, this is how I remember it, and the details you remember versus the details that you invented, you can't tell one from the other based on certainty. It has a subjective sense of being remembering I was there and I was talking to you. I was there when the place, and I can place the time. Autobiographical with a sense of place and time. And that's what we normally mean when we talk about memory. This kind of memory is also cortically consolidated. At age 8, what we had in long-term memory, we're able to convert into permanent memory. Long-term memory lasts about 3 months. Permanent memory we remember always, without having to go back to the library. Now we just remember the story. We don't remember the event itself. So some of you can remember back to stories that happened before age 8. And I can remember slides that my parents showed me of trips we'd taken before that age. But at this point, I can't tell you if I'm remembering the slide and the story they told me, or if I'm remembering the event itself. Because having lacked the permanent memory before then, I didn't store a permanent story in story form. Up until that time, in order to get back a memory, I had to go to the library and revive that event. And the library would look it up, they would reactivate everything that you stored during that event, and you'd reconstruct in your mind what the event was. And to do that, you'd have to have all the feelings and the reactions that you had with the event, because it was like sort of experiencing it again. And we know that when we pull back one of these permanent memories, that we can experience them with no emotion at all. We can just tell the story. And we can edit out part of the story, or we can put in more of the story. We can do whatever we want with the story. It's just a story. And if we want to, we can maybe look for the feelings. We can look in the library. But all we need to have at that point is a story. Now, I'll tell you this much. When a traumatic event has been converted into that kind of memory, where it's now a story that we can edit, and in whatever we want, way we want, we can tell all of it or part of it, all of the traumatic aspects of that event have been removed. The event can be considered completely processed once it becomes a permanent memory that is in story form. And one of the effects of post-traumatic stress is that it shuts down REM sleep. So people with post-traumatic stress are not able to process during rapid eye movement sleep memories from long-term memory into permanent memory, because that's where the final conversion takes place. So blocking people's sleep is going to block the processing of this kind of emotion. Okay, so we have a little sense now for the two kinds of memory and how information is processed. Let's put that information to work. What are the effects of trauma on memory and information processing? Well, first, I want to say that there's two kinds of trauma. Type B traumas are the ones that we're used to thinking about. Those are the bad things that happen. So if we are somehow shot by a gun, that's a bad thing that happened. We're not designed for that kind of activity. That's a trauma. The other kind of trauma is the type A traumas are the absence of necessary good things. So that if a person requires a joyful face looking at them in order to develop, and they grow up with no joyful faces, this is also a trauma. It's the absence of a necessary good thing, and it will also produce certain results in someone that keep them from developing those parts that would go along with joy, which by now we ought to have a fairly good idea what they might be. Well, if we go back to the type B traumas, they have a very large impact on our nervous system. And they happen in, this response starts out in the guard shack or amygdala. talking about. There's one on either side. When these get information, while I'm at it pointing at that thing, you might also see a purple area, a large, long purple area. That's the library. When the amygdala gets really upsetting information, the guard shack says, danger, danger, it can do four things. The first we'll call an armed response. It triggers the sympathetic nervous system, and that some of you might know of as the fight or flight response. It says, we got to do something about this right now. It charges your body with adrenaline. You're ready to charge and go, and we're going to fight this one out. This is, something we just have to be as energized as possible to deal with. The second thing that the guard shack can do is to trigger a disaster shutdown, and that would be done through the parasympathetic nervous system. In other words, it would say the only way to survive this is to shut down all systems and all power and to lay very still and very quiet, and we'll shut everything off and hopefully we'll survive whatever's about to come our way, because there's no way to outrun it, no way to get away from it. All we can do is just conserve as much energy as possible, and maybe we'll make it through this. So they shut down all the systems of your body. The next one is what I call calling out the fire department, and that is the release it secretes neurohormone called ACTH, which sends down to the adrenal glands, and the adrenal glands then begin to pump cortisol. Now, cortisol, we're going to go into in a minute, is basically a central nervous system solvent. It will actually begin to dissolve your nervous system and the connections that just formed. And it says, whatever you just learned, unlearn it. So it says, you had an experience, let's say you touched the stove, and your brain doesn't want you to learn to touch the stove again. It immediately starts to release this so that your nervous system doesn't say, oh, let's keep repeating that. That was an intense experience. It's like, no, we do not want that one running right now. Dissolve that, erase it, call out the fire department, shut that one down. We don't want to learn that response right there. And so that's the fire department. Then what it does is it will send the significant information onto the library for study. So it says, we have an emergency situation here. We do one of these three things, and then send the information to the library and say, find out what you have on file about the emergency that we're experiencing here. Now, if the guard shack has been traumatized, it doesn't respond in a normal way. And by traumatized, we mean it's been overwhelmed. Something has come in that's been larger than your joyful identity's capacity to handle, and so it just blew your nice functioning brain circuits into disarray. That's traumatized. And so when that happens to the guard shack, as you find in post-traumatic stress disorder, what the guard shack does sitting in class, and the teacher is trying to teach you the alphabet. What the teacher is saying comes into your ear sends it down to the central receiving sends it up to the guard shack says, you ever heard the letter A before? Got nothing on the letter A. Sends it over to the other guard shack. So you got anything on the letter A? Nothing over here. Send it back. You got anything on the letter A? And they ping pong the information back and forth until they drop it. So anything which is neutral is rendered unimportant by the guard shack. We're only paying attention to really scary stuff. Sorry, that isn't scary. And so all the information that isn't scary gets dropped out. Now suppose somebody across the room is trying to get together a spit wad. Well, that could be scary. Immediately, the guard shack takes that information and passes it on to the library, who then says, oh, we got stuff on spitwads here for sure. Send it up to the head librarian. Got any feelings about that? Oh, yeah, babe, I got a lot of feelings about that. And thoughts about that one, too. And we send it up to the identity center, and now we're paying attention to that kid over there with the spitwad. We're all into that. Tracking the scary information, but ignoring the neutral stuff. And the guard shack will hyperactivate to alarming material. That means it really gets a big response whenever something scary comes along, which means that that person's brain then begins to only track the things that they're afraid of. So your mental experience consciously is only made up of things that are scary to you. That's all you pay attention to. Any other information gets dropped out, doesn't even get passed on to your mind. You're only paying attention to the trouble that's going on, in other words. I had one woman who had a hyperactivation to this. She used to go out, be driving along, she'd see a pool hall. That got her attention, so she stopped. Why? Because pool halls are pretty scary places if you're a young single woman. But her amygdala grabbed that one, say, there, look at that. She got her attention, she stopped at the pool hall. She'd go into the pool hall, and she began looking around. Pretty soon she'd notice that biker guy on the other side that looked mean and ugly and big and scruffy, and she'd start watching him because he's the scariest thing in the place. Pretty soon he says, hey, that girl's checking me out. And he says, she notices that he's responding. She's really paying attention now. She can't get her eyes off of him. He's waltzing across the room, say, hey, how about it? Let's go. And so pretty soon she's out riding out of there on the back of the bike. Scariest progression, you see. And she does it time after time after time. The guard shack is tracking only the scary things in the environment. Missed all the other places she could have gone and all the other people she could have seen. These are the people who, if I was there, that's the place I wouldn't go. The person I wouldn't look at, the person I wouldn't hang out with, the person I wouldn't be interested in, because that'd be scary, you see. But that's the only thing on the screen, the only thing the radar picked up. It also causes fear. They kept track of all the scary things in life, and they have passed by all the things that are joyful. And what will happen then is if the guard shack gets really alarmed, it'll deactivate In other words, if your joyful identity is weak, it'll even overwhelm your sense of self. Shut that down, and Brokaw's region is where we speak. So we suddenly become sort of mute. We just have no words to say. We're just too scared to talk. And so whatever we might have said or thought that might have been helpful is gone. And our thinking brain gets shut down, and we get sent off on simple problem solving now. How do I get out of this mess? Not by acting like myself, but anything that gets me out of here is all I'm interested in. Well, if this condition persists, the brain begins to pump cortisol. That's the central nervous brain that's fresh, new growth. It also dissolves that. So during times of high growth of the brain, if you traumatize an individual right then, you not only wipe out what they were just learning, but you also wipe out whatever was just growing right then. And you get a lesion in the brain, a spot of brain that's gone. And so now as we begin to match this with what we were talking about earlier, we realize that you can wipe out certain parts of the brain by traumatizing the individual at the time that that part of the brain is growing, which is very significant at certain ages. The current studies indicate that the levels of cortisol are directly related to nerve loss in some parts of the brain, particularly the library. Different studies have come up with figures of cortisol that goes on for some period of time. It simply wipes out the brain cells, destroys them. They're gone. Not good for your brain at all. And that's where you keep memories, right there. So it makes very, very spotty memory recall after that. And how happen? I was with a fellow recently, had been married for 50-some years. His wife had suddenly died, and he couldn't remember the month after his wife had died, and he couldn't remember what he'd been doing earlier that day, and his mind, anything having to do with memory, was just not focused, not able to pull anything back. He was swimming in cortisol. His mind could not make the adjustment to this enormous loss and the pain of it, and so anything that was tried to put in memory was immediately washed out. And it was for him a period of almost 4 to 5 months before he'd sufficiently gotten through his grief that his cortisol levels came down, and he could now begin to form memories again and remember what was going on day to day. Well, you might want to recall that if you don't return to joy at the end of a day, that is to say you let the sun go down on your wrath, your body will begin pumping cortisol. And overnight you'll be bathing in this stuff. Not good for your brain. Well, what we're going to look at now is how is managing emotions tied to this kind of trauma. We can see how it would be affecting our memory, but how will it deal with our emotions? Well, here it is. This memory out of here. Got to make sure this doesn't happen again. Our joyful identity has been overwhelmed, and we can't manage this at all. And this happens during the joyful identity growth periods. It wipes out our joyful identity. That joy structure that we were growing gets dissolved and destroyed. That happens, of course, during the 6 to 12 months of age period of time. So traumatize a child during that age, and they will lack a capacity for joy because that part of their brain has been new growth, got wiped out by the cortisol. So you don't want traumas to happen to children in that age range if you want them to have a strong joyful identity. Well, if it happens during the return to joy period, so that they can't return to joy now from that feeling because there's a trauma associated with it. That brain circuit is wiped out. There was something growing there, it's gone now. It's literally physically missing. If you traumatize a child during the the integration of self, the 18 to 24 month period of time, when the brain is trying to grow that unified brain structure that says I'm one person while returning to joy from all these different emotions, what happens is that whatever parts were being connected become disconnected. And now you have people who act like themselves with very few of their emotions. In fact, every different emotional state or mood they go into act like a coherent self. You change moods, you change the reactions, you change very intensely from one sense of being one person to another. But if you wait just a bit longer to the 2 to 3 year period of time, Right then is when the librarian is being grown. Now, all of us have noticed that we have what we call infantile memory will be usually in somewhere in the age 2 to 3. And that's because that left hemisphere memory depends on the librarian. The library. And the library is only myelinated, it's only developed somewhere around 2.5, 2 to 3 years of age. And right then it hardwires. Well, now if you disrupt someone's memory circuits at the time that that library is getting put together, you have a very interesting effect. They don't remember that they're the same person now when they try to remember consciously from one kind of event to another. In other words, they would act like they were a different person with no memory of who they were or what they were doing when they were acting like a different person. Because the library is now disrupted. There's permanent damage to the library structure that would let you remember that you're the same person in all these different events. Well, we simply call that dissociative identity disorder or multiple personality. I don't remember I'm the same person when I try to remember me in different events. Over here, I think I'm one person. Over there, there's no connection. The file says that's not the same person, I'm somebody else. Fairly unremarkable bit of library disruption. Well, it's remarkable in the sense that none of us would want it, but it's hardly a mystifying sort of event. It's a very physical phenomena based by traumatizing what was developing right then, pulling that part of the file on out so that that part of your experience isn't unified into the rest of your experience. Lost my spot here. Yes, question.
What you were saying about before the age of 2, one of the most significant aspects of the New Age, of course, is age regression back to birth. Are you saying that that's physiologically impossible to remember that?
Okay, the question is with the New Age interest and the age regression back to birth, which is clearly before the age of 2, is that kind of thing physically impossible? And the answer is, in terms of remembering the logical story of your life, you cannot do that, no. You cannot, there's no mechanism with which to retrieve the memories before the library was in place. What you have before then are right hemispheric memories, which are experienced immediately as though they're happening, but there's no conscious sense of recall. So if you're recalling that story, you're making it up, whatever goes back before your library is in place. Yes? Okay, the question is, if I was to develop different personalities at the time that the library is myelinating, how would that form throughout life and cause it to kick in at different points in time? Well, there are a number of conditions that are necessary for that to develop across the lifespan. One is that the child has to continue to be in a non-healing environment, because if there's no way to integrate these parts of experience on an ongoing basis, they will continue to stay separated. And to do that, you have to continually, in some way, overwhelm the guard shack so that they don't ever come back together. But the second part of the second aspect of that is that the development of those patterns is triggered by outside events. The guard shack looks over, again, the different specific events trigger it. Yeah, the guard shack looks over something and says, I've got something on file that looks like this problem, and it would activate the part of the library that was related to that, which would be independent from the other. So it's internal, it's external stimuli. That's what we call dissociated pieces, yeah, that are disconnected from each other. Yeah, well, I'm going to go ahead with my notes here. Well, you have Ed? All right. Question about how to deal with those memories that are recorded prior to age 2.5 or the presence of the library, and how we deal with that. And I'm trying to look at this to see if I'm getting to that later in the lecture or not. Well, I might as well answer it here. Yeah, I probably have everyone's attention here, Ed, so I'll go ahead and work on it right now. Oh yeah, okay. Mm-hmm. Okay, even though it's precognitive, Ed reminds us, the trauma has effect on the brain. That effect is located entirely in right hemispheric memory, which, as you recall, is non-focal and has an immediate sense of being recalled. So when that memory is activated, which it is by later events, anything that similar to that event activates the memory, just like my picking up the glass activates the memory of holding glasses. Anything that's similar to that event activates it. It comes back to you in the form of an immediate experience. It feels like it's happening again now. The only problem is there's no record in my library of this ever having happened to me. And it's impossible to have a record of it in the library of ever having happened to me. What you have then is a process, which we'll go into more in a little bit when I get past a couple more things that develop in the brain, of trying to get your left hemisphere to look at what's in the right hemisphere and decide how to put together an accurate story that would explain what's happening to you right now. In other words, you need to get a truthful story about what your right hemisphere is telling you and convert that into a story form. But you do that in a very much a sort of a detective sort of a way. You say, okay, here's the information I have, I'm observing, and when you have a resolution to that matches both the left and the right hemisphere, your mind will be at peace and at rest about that. But that, to be explained that, we have to get a little bit farther down. About age 3 or a little bit before, the corpus callosum bodies at the same time, with really no connection between them. So what's going on in the right hemisphere is its own business. What's going on in the left hemisphere is its own business. But once this main information tract between the two of them myelinates, information can be exchanged back and forth. At this point, what I talk about has something to do with what I feel. Up until that point in time, you can talk to a child about their feelings, and your talking to them will have no effect on what they're feeling. They'll stay just as upset as they were if you hadn't been talking to them. Or they might be able to hold a discussion with you about the subject if they're not too terribly upset, but it doesn't soothe them at all. What actually soothes them is your voice tone, or your interaction, your nonverbal communications with them, which might mislead you into thinking that what you're saying actually is having some effect, but it's talking to a disconnected part of the brain. Well, after the point that these two parts of the brain are connected, then we have a chance of combining our right hemispheric memories with our left hemispheric memories. And at that point, we look up any event and we want to say, what did I feel and experience about it? And does it match what I think about it? And if there's a match between those two things that match perfectly, we're at peace with it. And if there is a mismatch, that what I experienced and what I believed and thought about it do not really perfectly match, then we have a discomfort, a distress about it. And that will continue to fester in our minds until we can get those two things to match in a way that truthfully accounts for all that's going on. At this point, if we go move the tape on up to the recovery process, what we're actually trying to do with people is help them to have a left hemispheric story of what happened to them in those first years of life that matches the feelings that they were experiencing at that time. And so in order to do that, you have to do a number of things. One of which is make sure that there's enough joyful identity available to handle the intensity of what you're going to work on and remember, because without the joyful identity, you can't manage to think about this coherently at once. And then you're going to have to find a process that leads you into truthfully dealing with what is the truth, or what would be the true story of what happened to me at that time. To do that, you'll take all the information stored in your hemisphere as it comes back, your right hemisphere as it comes back, and the guidance of the Holy Spirit on the other hand, and a process that involves someone usually guiding you who's being very careful not to suggest things to you that weren't there to begin with. Because at this point, when you're reconstructing the story, it's very much like doing archaeology. You want to carefully reconstruct it without adding any details to it. If you're excavating a tell in the Mideast and you're going down and you're getting into the early Canaanite levels and all that sort of thing, and as you're excavating, you drop your McDonald's cup inside there, you don't want to go into the excavation next day and say, oh, they had McDonald's back there in the Canaanite period. You see? That's a later addition. You don't want it dropped in. You want to be very careful about those sorts of things. And you also want to make sure that the interpretations that you have are true. And to do that involves the presence of the Holy Spirit in all of these events. So there's an element of care. There's an element of remembering and turning that into a story that is truthful. And once the truthful story has been told, then there's a peace about it, and it converts right over into our permanent memory, and from that point on we can tell the story without reverting to the feelings. Now I've shortened that and left all kinds of details, but that is the brain part of that. Now the disorders that are connected with this kind of damage, if you have joy ring deficits, in other words, the guard shack gets information before your conscious mind gets involved. It takes over and acts before your will can be involved. Your will, as far as your mind is concerned, is up in your cortex. So they can actually get you to do things without and beyond the control of your will by putting that information in instructions into the guard shack. Because the guard shack will get the information before you have a chance to get it and choose and get you to have certain responses. So that's where mind control programming is put in. Now, I'm not going to say anything more about that, so don't even ask me questions, because that is a very information-intensive kind of subject. I will say, of course, that the Lord is quite capable of leading people to freedom out of that, too. So, you know, not to worry, but we're not going to discuss it in this conference. Okay. So the amount or the size of the problem that we can deal with is directly related to the size of our joyful identity. How big is your joy bucket? So if you want to deal with those emotions that are related to trauma, you're going to have a big enough capacity to handle that emotion when it comes on out. And to do that, you have to have two things. You have to have a joy bucket that's big enough to handle that emotion, and you have to know, once you got that bucket full, how to get back to joy with that. Otherwise, you can't handle the memory. And what you'll discover, as we discovered along the way, is that many people will have small, I hate to use the word even, small trauma memories come back to them first. Because that's as big as their joy bucket is. And they'll work on those, and it's only as they go along and growing in relationship that they develop a big enough joy bucket and learn how to get back to joy from some of these events in smaller forms before they get onto the really big ones. Now that often is discouraging to counselors as well as to counselees, and they ask questions like, why does it take so long? Why does it save the worst for last? A variety of things like that. But there's actually very, very good logic to this. There are some things that the mind is actually learning to do. And when we forget that the brain actually has to learn things, even though we might be praying and ministering and dealing with the person, the brain is still involved and it has to actually learn and develop some capacities. Just like it would if we were teaching somebody to walk again after they hadn't been able to walk. You just don't take them out and have them run the LA Marathon. It's just not the next step. Maybe one day they'll get there, but they're going to get that by training their strength on the way up. And so to say that, which is often the case. If you ask me about almost anybody I'm counseling has a traumatic background, I can give you a list of traumas that we know are there, but we just can't get to. What does that mean? Does that mean that it's necessarily blocked demonically? Well, sometimes it is. Does it mean that the person just doesn't want to do it? Sometimes it does. But also, sometimes it means that there is not the joy capable of handling that feeling, and some of the simple paths to return to joy for that kind of event are not in place. So were that to come in, they would merely be overwhelmed and re-traumatized again. It can't be contained in memory. Once they can remember the event, they can contain it in their memory, however upset they are, you are in at least a position to teach them how to return to joy. Remember what returning to joy is? That means someone is glad to be with me. So at that point, if they have a strong relationship with Christ and they know that Christ is glad to be with them in that event, you're home. At that point, it's simply a matter of knowing how to pray and minister with people effectively. There's no point at that point to, slow the process down, back off anything. That event from that point on is open to clear, complete, total healing, never to come back again, just to be stored as a story of the wonderful thing that Jesus did in my life. But if they can't contain it in their memory, they're overwhelmed, it just won't hold there, they get the flashbacks, but they can't pull it together, you've got a lack of joy or a lack of returning to joy, and almost certainly a lack of joy. So you have to do practically joy bucket building experiences. Climb Joy Mountain. Be joyful to be together. Get that strength up so that they're able to deal with this when it comes along. Now, the emotions, the central emotions to be regulated by the right orbital prefrontal cortex. These are the main ones that require return to joy circuits. We've talked about them along the way. If you can handle these, you're practically a home free. These are the ones that are neurologically embedded in your right orbital prefrontal cortex. They're rage, terror, now, I will just talk very briefly about the first two by saying that those are both energizing emotions. They turn on the fight or flight response, the rage and terror, and they pump adrenaline. You get very energized when you get these emotions. The next three, shame, disgust, and hopeless despair, are parasympathetic emotions. They de-energize you, they shut you off, they call out the emergency response. It just shuts down all systems in your body. And so people who fall into these, often who have no return to joy, will try to move over to either rage or terror as a way out to re-energize themselves. So you often find little footpaths trying to sneak around from shame, disgust, and hopeless despair into rage or terror. If I can at least get angry about it, I can energize myself and get out of this stuck position. Now, for most counselors, the hardest one is hopeless despair. And as I go around the country and consult with people, most often they are stuck because the counselor does not want to go to hopeless despair with them. We think that as counselors, we're here to make people hopeful. The odd thing is that the way that we make people hopeful is by sharing their intense feeling of hopeless despair with them and showing them the way back to joy. Even we find the Apostle Paul talking about his intense sense of hopeless despair. He talks to churches, he said, we had despaired of life. And yet he goes on to talk about how he continued to minister anyway. But he was in hopeless despair. We find Jesus probably in some sense of hopeless despair in the garden. But nonetheless, that didn't stop him at all from acting like himself, just because he felt that way. He was able to go on acting like himself, as was the Apostle Paul. So when we share hopeless despair, we're talking about an emotion. The fact that I feel hopeless despair has nothing whatsoever to do with whether the situation is hopeless. What does hopeless despair mean to your nervous system? And once I tell you this, you will see why it is a very good idea for all of us to get there frequently. Hopeless despair means a very important problem has to be solved with less time and less resources than I have. I got something so big that with the amount of time I've got to deal with it and the amount of resources I have, I can't solve it. I can't deal with it. Your mind responds by saying, overload, tilt, you can't pick up that truck and carry it. Hopeless despair. Say, let's put it in physical terms. Let's say a huge semi-truck lands on your beloved doll. I really hate to have it land on anything else at this point. It lands on your beloved doll. You want to pick that whole semi-truck up and move it over to get your doll out. And your nervous system says, you can't do that. You can't move it. You can't get your doll out of there. It won't go in the amount of time that you have and the amount of energy and resources you have. This is too big for you. Proper response is hopeless despair. Otherwise, you'd go keep trying to do this and you wouldn't register that this is not a good plan. Well now, if we're ever going to be about the work of the kingdom of God, and he's ever going to march us into something that's too big for us to do in the amount of time he has for us to do it, what is the appropriate response? Hopeless despair. We should feel hopeless despair. It is too big for me to do in the amount of time I have and the amount of energy that I've got. What would it be like me to do under these circumstances? Be like me to cry out to God and say, this is just a God-type moment here. This must be the place. This must be the time. You see, he called us to be his witnesses, right? You shall be my witnesses. Now, what does a witness do? Looks, watches, sees what's going on. So, in terms of the most important counseling relationships, the most important spiritual warfare you're ever going to do, you're going to be a witness. You're going to be watching and seeing what God does there. It means it's too big and too hard for you to do in the amount of time involved. Sometimes people have said to me they've sensed the Spirit of Christ in them in the session and says, Jesus is here and he's guiding what's going on right now. And he wants you to know that you don't know what's happening right now. He's just going to take care of this and you'll probably learn something from it. And I sit back and I let the Holy Spirit guide us through this. I've had counselees tell me this. It's not too surprising to me because I run into a lot of things that are too big for me to solve in the amount of time. I ought to feel hopeless despair. I do. It just fits the event. I said, well, this sure makes me feel hopeless. I'm sure glad we've got God. That's that, Dad's here. That's, it's too big for me. This is an appropriate feeling. You see, it doesn't mean the situation is hopeless. It just informs me that me is too small. And very often, the people we're counseling with, me is too small. And when we're going to throw them that life ring, so it'll land right where they are, we're going to go right to them and say, you know what, I understand me is too small. I can feel that too. I can feel that me and you and you and you and me, we're both too small here. What a wonderful thing. We're on the front row seat for what God has got to do. You see? When we're in hopeless despair, this is marvelous. This is kingdom territory. We've stepped out. And so God keeps calling us into hopeless despair. Have you had that in your life? Have you gotten there? Have you said, this must be the place? Because if you don't get me out of this, I'm cooked. Hopeless despair. And out of that, faith. Wonderful response to hopeless despair. But when counselors won't go there and they try to talk somebody out of it, oh, it's not that bad, oh, it's okay, and they're trying to talk them out of it, the life ring just goes halfway. So it's not that bad, I'll just, throw it there, and if you can swim up to that spot, I'll pull you out. We don't have a return to joy. So we return to joy by saying, I'll join you in your hopeless despair. That makes sense. Good stuff, hopeless despair, isn't it? Don't you want to just go out of here and have some? You do if you know how to act like yourself. And if you know that, you want to make sure that everybody else who feels that knows how to act like themselves too. It's good news. You don't want anybody that you ever met not to know the good news of what it's like us to do when we feel hopeless despair. To me, it just sort of pumps me up a little bit. Of course, I still do like watching somebody else's life illustrate that better than my own. It's uncharitable of me, I'm sure. Okay. This gives us a sense of wisdom all of a sudden about what we're doing. It also gives us a sense of why God takes his time on some particular cases that might have puzzled us up until now. He's building people in joy. He's a lot more interested in building your identity than he is in just resolving traumas per se. Because the only reason to resolve a trauma is to turn it into a memory. And a memory is remembering who we are so that we can act like ourselves in the future. And so in that sense, we don't know who we are so we can act like ourselves in the future until we have had the truth of Christ in our life, who tells us in that moment, in that place, in that specific time, who we are. So that from that point on, no one can tell us lies about us and who we are. Now, with that in mind, we're going to look at a few other aspects of the brain's function that will illustrate this for us. And this is kind of Brain Introduction 101. This is fun. Again, when you see here is the brain from the side. And if you look at that brain from the side, you see the brain stem sticking down at the bottom there. And as it points up to the top of the brain, it kind of forms a diagonal line through the brain. Can you imagine that diagonal line being there? It would sort of zip through my ear like this if I had the line illustrated on me. That we will call the motor strip. That little part of the brain is involved in running your body, actually making it move and flop around and stuff like that. Interesting part of the body. That is where I had a stroke as a boy. You see it? Put out the motor strip, I couldn't move half my body. So that's very interesting. That left half couldn't move. It was the right half motor strip that was out. Very fascinating to me. You folks could care less. But what we're going to do with that division is we're going to say everything in front of that we'll call the front of the brain. With me so far? And everything behind that we're going to call the back of the brain. So the brain has a front and a back. And a motor strip in the middle. Kind of keeps the two of them apart so they don't get messed up. Well, the front of the brain is where the prefrontal So, let's say somebody said to me, did you actually take an extra cookie at lunch today? And they look kind of annoyed. Now, if my guard shack looks at that and go, mad face, what's the answer to this problem? Don't tell them about the extra cookie you took at lunch. It will switch to the back of your brain to solve the problem, and I'll say, nope. However, if it goes to the front of my brain and it says, now, Wilder, you need to act like yourself. And you know, you are a Christian, son of God, and those sorts of things, and it's like you to tell the truth if you're acting like your true self like that. Then I would say, yeah, it was very good. I actually, you know, got it from the other side of the table even, and I'm glad I had 2 chocolate chip cookies today, and I hope nobody else had to go without one. But, you know, I have a little compassion in there, but not much when it comes to cookies. That's the front of my brain talking about it. It's like me to do that, you see, to tell the truth, even though it might not be the most convenient thing. The other thing about the front of the brain is that it's flexible, it's creative, it can come up with lots of different ways of expressing who I am, whereas the back of the brain is interested only in one thing, solving the problem. Now, what you might be interested to know if you're working with dissociative identity disorders, almost all of the personalities are located in the back of the brain. They are all there problem solving only. They have no interest in acting like themselves, they're there to solve a problem. And to them, the most direct response that solves that problem is what they're going to do. You might also be interested to know that anytime the amygdala, the guard shack, kicks on, it activates the back of the brain, preferentially. So if it says there's something scary, it will turn on the back of the brain to solve the problem. Let's suppose that all of us took a nice trip out to Africa and we're sitting out there by the Serengeti on the plane, and we want to go down to the old watering hole and watch the sunset. And the front of our brain would take over this project and say, well, I'd like to sit over here. No, I think I'll sit over here. The view is a little bit nicer. And I think I'll sit on this chair. And I think I'd prefer to drink lemonade instead of water. And I certainly don't want any of the water from the watering hole, but this would be a nice thing to drink, and I'd prefer this. And, well, I think I'll wear this cooler outfit because, you know, it's still kind of warm. And all of those are my preferences. You see, they're like me to do this. I'm choosing these sorts of things. And about that time, that lion we spoke of earlier comes wandering along, and the guard shack says, lion, and I shoot up the closest thorn tree. It just solved a problem. What you do with lion, you shoot up a thorn tree. Now, if someone came along and said to me, now, why did you like this thorn tree? Did you prefer this thorn tree over that thorn tree? And do you like sitting on those thorns? They do seem a little longer, perhaps they're more comfortable to you. And you like the view from there better? I would just tell them, just shut up. That would be the back of my brain talking right there, solving a problem. I want them to quit annoying me. Not thinking about whether it would be like me to do that. I would just want, I'm solving a problem. I'm up here to get rid of the lion, and I don't care what kind of tree I was in, and now I'm thinking about it. I'd rather be in another tree, but that's, you know, irrelevant here. We're solving a problem. It's a fear-based problem. I'm up the tree. Okay? Difference of the two things. The real simple example, when I was coming here, I thought to myself, oh, I'm going to Iowa, cold weather. Cold weather, what clothes should I wear? I'm going to pick all of the warm clothes. Obviously, I didn't check the forecast. But I bring the warm clothes. Now, among those warm clothes that I brought, that's the back of my brain solving a problem. What do you do? Cold weather, warm clothes. Among those, I had to pick one shirt that I preferred to wear today. I knew this was going to be videotaped, and I thought, well, you know, I have to look better on this, and I have to match something to tie, and I like this tie better than that tie. That's the front of my brain trying to make a personal preference act like myself. I could have chosen lots of ties. Well, I don't have that many ties, to be truthful, but I would have still been able, that's also one of my preferences, to wear one as least often as possible. But these are the front of your brain making decisions to act like yourself. Now, you have the front and the back of the brain kind of in mind here. It's really not that hard. When we see people often who are just habitually lying, they're just giving you the answer, the first thing that solves the problem out of their mind, they're not thinking to themselves, was this like me to say this? What's the long-term benefit? The guard shack is just activating the back of their brain. And you find that this is what's happening in great sense with most of the alter personalities in a system. They're just there to solve a problem, whatever that problem might be. Now, the front of the brain is activated preferentially by joy and love. So if they're in an environment responding to joy and love, you tend to activate the front. If it's an environment dominated by fear, you tend to activate the back. Again, isn't this interesting? If you want to eliminate somebody's choices, you want to keep them from acting like themselves, what you do is you scare them. And of course, the largest scary thing around is pain. If you want to scare somebody effectively, threaten them with pain. So what does the enemy do to us? He threatens us with pain if we follow Christ. He threatens us with pain if we're faithful. He threatens us with pain if we do what God wants us to do. We're going to suffer. And the tendency is to have suffering push us to the back of the brain, to where we simply become problem solvers that'll do whatever it takes to get out of this. And most of the people come to us for counseling and help are also in the back of their brain just doing whatever it takes to get out of this. They have no idea that the call of all of this is not simply to find whatever it takes to get out of this, because if you actually follow Christ, you'll be getting to more of this than you were getting out of. It's learning to act like yourself in the presence of that, which is stimulated by, called to, activated by the presence of joy. Lo, I am with you always, wherever you are, whatever you're in, I'm there with you, we'll be together, this is going to be all right. And you can act like yourself under those circumstances. That's the call to activate the joy center of the brain. I could almost preach on that. Now, the next way to look at the brain is to say that it has the left and right. And we've talked a little bit about that with the right memory and the left memory and that kind of thing. But there's another very important thing about the left and the right, which I want us to look at here. The left of things. And it's very tenacious with its explanations. It will hold them even in the experience of evidence to the contrary. So, if I went outside today and I told you there's a sun, you'd look up in the sky, there's a sun, sure enough. So there it is, okay, I believe you. Took you out tonight and I said, no, there's no sun. Yeah, look up in the sky, no sun. Your left side of your brain, hold on to that belief. Now I've seen it before, it's coming back. Even if I don't see a sun, I still believe that there's one there. And so that explanation, because I got an explanation of things, this is how it runs, I'll hold on to it, even in the evidence to the contrary piles up all over the place. What the left side of the brain does, in the absence of the right side of the brain, is that it will hold on to an explanation regardless. So if you can actually deactivate the right side of a person's brain and just leave the left side running, which can be done by certain medical conditions or by injecting anesthesia into the right carotid artery, which makes that part of the brain go to sleep, you will persist in an explanation even if it makes no sense at all, because one time it did. So you have a person who's paralyzed on the left side of their body, right side of their brain is not activated, and you ask them to pick something up. And they will say, okay, did you pick it up? Yeah. That part of their brain, their body didn't move, they're paralyzed. But they will look at that, they'll see it, they'll make no account of it at all. They'll just say, well, yeah, I picked it up. And if you insist on pointing it out to them, no, your arm is still there and the thing hasn't been picked up, they say, oh, I didn't feel like it. That's the other explanation they have on file. If I didn't do something, I didn't feel like it. They won't ever change their point of view that their mind is paralyzed. I mean, their body's paralyzed, that's why it didn't move. It's a very odd phenomenon that happens with a particular neurological condition. Your left side of your brain persists in explanations regardless of how they came along, even if they don't work, even if they don't fit, unless the right side of your brain is activated, and the right side of your brain and it's only in the presence of that upset that the left hemisphere will change its explanation. So it's only when the right hemisphere says, I see the whole picture, something is wrong, we got to change our explanation, that you get a change in explanation. So this has a number of interesting applications. You go home to teach your church about spiritual warfare. They have an explanation in their left hemisphere that's locked in there. This is how the world works, this is what's going on. I don't believe you. Well, I've got this case and I got this case and I did this and I heard this and I went to this conference. Doesn't change their explanation at all. Not until they experience something which upsets them. Then at the moment that they're upset, the left hemisphere comes unlocked and go, we got to have a new explanation here. So that's naturally why I pray for God to upset people. It's not unkind. Because if they don't experience that, something about this really doesn't fit, it upsets me inside, I can't live with this, then we'll change the explanation. Well, it works the other way around too. Suppose we land on an explanation about a trauma or something that happened to us that's actually a lie, it's not true. When our right hemispheres look at that, it says something about this doesn't fit, something about this doesn't fit. It just doesn't fit, it just doesn't fit. We continue to have distress about that until the two explanations match. And so God has created this also so we can go back against and look at all the lies that may have been implanted by our experience to tell us that something that happened to us wasn't true. We were told it was true. For instance, that happened to you because you're dumb. Or, I hit you because you're really stupid. Well, that gets locked in there. We're thinking to ourselves, that must be it. Or sometimes we make up the explanations ourselves. I just deserved this. The explanation locks in. It's there in our left hemisphere. It runs along, just happy as can be, explaining these events. Whenever something comes along, we activate those memories. That's our experience. It interprets everything for us. Something in the other hemisphere looks at the whole picture and goes, something about that just doesn't fit. There's something wrong with that. And we get upset. But if we go back to the original event where that lie about us was inserted, and we're able to have all of the upset feelings that go with that, all the information is activated, and we look at the explanation and say, let's get an explanation that matches, one that's entirely truthful. At that point in time, it's possible to change the explanation and say, here's the truth about what's going on. No, it is not as you have always believed, that the reason that you were raped was because you were just a dirty girl, and that's what happens to you. No, you know the truth about it. Well, what would be the truth about that? We could come up with lots of explanations, but I want to point you to an 8-step process that we have used in our counseling center to work on this. This process has been considered controversial for over 20 years, and it's controversial for one simple reason, and that is because we actually believe that the Spirit and presence of the living God ministers truth to people about their lives and helps them know the truth about who they are. Some people believe that means we are receiving new scripture from God somehow or another, and because we're believing a new inspired word that isn't just read right out of scripture, that we are therefore adding to scripture somehow or another, or some variety on that teaching. And I don't mean to criticize that point of view, because we really have to be very careful about adding anything new to our theology or beliefs. This kind of experience of God appearing is always subject to several truths and tests of the results, for one thing. They're the results that it produces, resemble the results that God produces. Does it pass the test of being what God has told us in Scripture? And does it pass the test of being able to be validated by the other people with whom we fellowship? And so these are some of the tests that we use in dealing with this. But nonetheless, for that very purpose, it has been very strongly attacked. In fact, Brother Ed Smith in the back there, who has his theophostic counseling, is currently being critiqued on exactly this score. He has something that resembles this approach, and much the same attack is being leveled against him. But we are not claiming, and I would say neither is he, from my experience of working with him for a number of years, that we are receiving a new revelation from God as though we're receiving Scripture. We are experiencing God in the present, and He is redeeming our lives by speaking the truth about what was actually He created in us and why this event, as we interpreted it, was actually a deception somehow about who we are. And we invite God into that, and we do it unashamedly and gladly. The original attack on this came because someone said it was guided imagery. Why does it look like guided imagery? Because it involves the right hemispheric memory, which is always imagistic. The right hemispheric memory, when it comes back, is an image. It's a picture. It's a sensory experience. So you invite that whole memory back there to be experienced and looked at. That's where you activate the whole right hemisphere. And then you ask the observing left hemisphere to observe about this and say, what do we know about this? What do we think about this? What do we now see and conclude if we ask Jesus to show us the truth about this image that we have? And many people experience at that point in time that they see Jesus in the image or the event. I personally have no trouble with that. Many of the things that they see Jesus doing are not what Jesus would do. Is that a problem to me? Not at all. It shows me what that person really believes Jesus would do. And of course, when we're dealing with those images that they're putting in there of what Jesus would do, for instance, I had someone imagine a situation in which they were being abused by their parent. We asked Jesus to come into that. I'd made a mistake in doing that in the way I did, but I'll get that in a second. And they said, "What is Jesus doing?" He says, "Well, he's slapping me." Saying, "You stupid kid." So why does he do that? Well, because God hates sin and I'm sinning. All right, well, we've got a picture here now. We now know what you think about Jesus. But am I going to go for that? No. My right hemisphere, if nothing else, goes, look at that whole picture. It just doesn't make sense to me. Doesn't remind me at all of any of my experiences of Jesus. The Spirit within me witnesses to something else as well. It says, we need to look into this a little farther. And we need to talk about this whole thing. Now, what I was doing wrong with that is that I didn't really start with having the person become truly connected with Jesus before we got into the memory, which is a mistake I used to make along the way. And to really make sure the person's connection with Jesus is intact. Very often when we get into the memory, because we're suddenly switched into a different part of the library where there's no Jesus on file, they will tell me, "Oh, it's gone." But we know just where the trail broke off. That's very informative. So we can begin to form a new trail there. It's very neurologically makes sense to me along the way, how these things work. Okay, so what are these steps? I'm going to stop defending them, just say this is what we do. We take God, the best evidence the upset, which activates the right hemisphere. You find the belief that goes with the upset. That event and the most upsetting feelings about the event, and with both hemispheres on and running, we invite Jesus right in there to say, "All right, now who am I? Put the flashlight back on me, show me who I am, what is it like me to do, what kind of a relational person am I?" And the most important part of that has already been done. I am a person in relationship to the Lord Jesus Christ at this moment, in this time, in this event. From that point on, it's downhill, folks. As soon as that has been crossed, Jesus may say some things. And most of the things that he says to people just produce an immediate peace. Now, when I say that he says something to people, Brother Ed Smith describes the responses in this way. He calls them the people who see Jesus and the ones who hear him, and the no hear, no see people. That's me most of the time. I don't really see or hear anything. I just know something is different in the truth. So some people whose auditory circuits are more activated may actually say, Jesus said something to me. Well, that's great. And the immediate result of what he said, which is usually something to me be totally trivial, but because he said it, it works just fine. For instance, Jesus says, it's the belief that I have is I'm stuck in this thing forever and I'll never get better. And Jesus says to them, "You'll be fine." That's impressive. It's only impressive because Jesus said it. And we know him, and so it's going to be true. And something inside both those hemispheres goes, I'm going to be fine. I didn't know that before. It's now absolutely, totally true. You can't bother me with that ever again. I just know that that's true. It all locks in. And then you can try to rattle those hemispheres back and forth. Nothing sets you off to wondering about that again. It's like, it's done. It's said. It's gone. Had I said that, it would be meaningless because I don't actually know the truth of that. But if Jesus said it, it's true. Now, some other people will experience a picture of him doing or saying something, but most people just know. It's like at that moment they say, no, I know that isn't true. I know that I'm going to be with Christ someday, and in fact, I'm here with you right now, and that's not what was going. I just know that isn't true, and the things have resolved. It's a wonderful sort of thing. Then you check the results. Right lie. Maybe we didn't get all of the experience that we needed to know in order to really see this. Or maybe we picked up one of several lies that are in there. And again, this is a process that Brother Ed has really outlined and trained people to do very nicely. Then when we are through with that little repeating process, we give thanks. Because that's really the difference between pagans and Christians anyway. Whatever we receive from God, we receive with thanks. So when we're able to give thanks, this is what marks us as a species. It's very much like us to do. It's joyful. It brings us gladness to be together. Sometimes when you find yourself blocked on step 4 that you can't get Jesus in to that event, when you're trying to invite the Lord to speak to the event, there's a number of things that can go wrong in that process. And again, I thank Brother Ed Smith for this. You might be asking the wrong question. You're trying to power through this in some way on your own. And God's very respectful of all of that. You still want to work on it? That's fine. You work on it. When you're done with it, when you get to hopeless despair, that is great. I'm right here. And the final thing is demonic blocking. That's not the final thing. He's got a really much longer list than that, but the final one I'm going to talk about today. Sometimes demons are standing in the way. You have to do some spiritual warfare to say, get out of here. You shut up. Stand over to the side. And when all of your effects are out of the way, now, let's invite Jesus into this moment. After that, you'll find that whatever hold that demonic spirit had is either greatly loosened or gone entirely, that they have no real claim on this event anymore because the person's no longer believing a lie about themselves. Well, when is bonding needed for healing? And in doing this, now we're just suddenly rewinding the tape. Because if you could just do what we were just talking about right there with every memory that a person has, you wouldn't need bonding in order for healing to occur. They already have a bond with the Lord Jesus Christ that's strong enough to invite him into any part of their life, and they have enough joy strength that they can invite any memory they have into their mind. So suppose that what we're just talking about there isn't working, in the sense that you can't get there yet. They can't get a whole memory to hold, or they have trouble experiencing Jesus in their life in some way, so that they have to yet develop a relationship with him. Now that's very different, I would even add at this point as a caution, from someone who has no relationship with Jesus Christ. Again, thanks very much to Brother Ed Smith for encouraging me along this line. I've begun to use this as an evangelistic tool with people who have no connection with Jesus at all. I remember recently this year I had a gay lesbian atheist in my office who had tried everything that she could to deal with her problems, and nothing had worked psychologically, and I suggested to her the possibility that we might ask God to help her with her problems. Well, she said she didn't believe in that much, but given that nothing else would work, why not? So we followed this process very nicely. I said, okay, we'll ask God to show you what goes on, and where he needs to, I didn't say he, where God needs to take you. I was very careful not to say that at this point in time. That was not an issue we needed to get into. And right then, we just invited God into this memory and asked for truth. And suddenly she tipped her head to the side and said, no, that isn't true. This is true. And we went on through a series of different memories like that. And At the end of the time, she looked at me and she said, you know, my God consciousness isn't very high. I really need to know more about this God who met me here today and healed me and touched my life. That's begun an interesting journey. We're not there to where her God consciousness is that high yet. But it's coming along and she's very interested. And now on a daily basis, before she goes to work, before she does other things, she stops and thanks God for all of the things that He's brought into her life. So we have a very grateful person who now knows that there is a God and has a relationship developing. They just don't know yet for sure who this God is that they're getting to know. I'm for that, you see. So I'm not meaning this when I say that someone needs a bond in order to relate to God. But some people can't relate to God for the simple reason that they're that disconnected, they're that loose, that they don't know who they are at all. They can't define themselves clearly enough to say, I'm an atheist. They're just all over the place. And they need some kind of attachment to even tell them that they're a person, that they're in a relationship, that they're still here, they're still working, they're relating with someone. And with them, you have to develop a bond in order for them to develop a self. So when is it needed? When there's I sent along, I believe, the chart on fear bonds and love bonds is on page 17 of the life model, but it didn't get included in your syllabus. So I'm going to have to encourage each of you to buy a copy of the life model, I'm afraid, and look at that. But it lets you look at what people's lives look like when they are fear bonded or love bonded, and how to move from one to the other, because when we're taking people out of the kingdom of darkness, we're taking them out of fear bonds and moving them into love bonds. And love bonds are characterized by joy. When their identity is built on weak bonds, so that they're not strongly attached to anyone, their attachment to the Lord Jesus will also be weak, because they just bond weakly with everyone yet. They have not learned how to bond with someone. And so they need to experience that bond with someone who is Christ to them in terms of the relationship of discipleship and helping them grow. Our motivation comes from bonds. So people who have not been motivated to joy in their life cannot anticipate that if they came to God, He would have joy in experience with them. So very often, the first experiences of learning joy, that someone is joyful and suddenly that can be a motive for you, are developed by experiencing someone who will communicate God's joy to you. So that you know, as people have said very often about people of faith, I know that God must love me because so-and-so did this. They were here with me, they responded. There must be somehow a response from God because He sent you. And that is part of the joy of being who we are, that we get to carry that message, however imperfect we might be. And that begins to provide them the motive of hope that there might be joy if they were to meet God. A joy-based it keeps track of just what Satan has in mind. The dragon loves to scare people. And if you're a dragon, that might be one of your best tactics. Because fear-bonded people will pay attention to the scariest thing in the world. And so if you wanted to look at this book that I've written basically on the Christian community, it's a community looked at from the point of view of love bonds and fear bonds. The red dragon cast down is a reference to that part in Revelation where the red dragon is cast down from heaven and he comes to earth to do battle with us. And in the middle of that battle, he's trying to destroy us. He's as scary as can be. And people often just in the church, whenever I go to teach a spiritual warfare seminar in my church, I have probably, half of the people that come to talk to me say, I'm just scared of that devil stuff. I don't want to think about that. I don't want to go there. I know you're teaching about that and all, but I just don't want to think about any of that. That scares me. They're fear tracking. They're fear bonded. They look at the spiritual warfare with the devil, they see something scary, and that's where their mind stops, right there. I see something scary. They don't go on to see something greater than that. And those who are love bonded go on and say, well, yeah, that's scary, but look, God is so much bigger. Why shouldn't we have a look at this thing? Because I want to look at the love here in this whole thing, something much bigger than the fear. But fear-bonded people stop right there. They track the dragon, which is exactly why he likes to bring pain and fear into their lives. Because from that point on, those who are tracking pain and fear are paying attention to what the dragon is doing. Consequently, when Jesus says to people that do not fear those who can destroy the body, but rather fear him who can cast both the body and the soul into hell, he's saying if all you want to pay attention to is fear, then look for the scariest thing in the universe. It isn't Satan. The scariest thing in the universe is God. That's why the fear of God is the beginning of wisdom. Well, what is the wisdom you learn if you begin to look at God? You'll learn that he loves you. Now, wonderful news. If all you can track is scary things, pay attention to God. He's the scariest, and when you pay attention to him, you find this wonderful thing. He loves you, and he's glad to be with you. This thing is God. What does God want you to do? Look at him. What do you see when you look at him? You see eyes that are glad to see you. Love. Forgiveness for whatever you did. This is God. The way back from fear is to go to the scariest thing in the universe. And very often God will call you to be the scariest thing in someone's life. Because it is exactly that they'll watch, and when they watch that, they will see that he is in you. And through that, there's joy and love. And many people come to me precisely because they're scared of men, because they're abused by men. And when they look at me, I hope that they see the Son of Man, because then they will know that there's love. Even in that way, having a male body has served me well. That's why God's good news can flow through anybody, even a man. Moves us from the back of the brain to the front. From being concerned with results, which, by the way, I would say to you all, is another sign that you're operating in the back of your brain. If you're looking for results, you're trying to solve a problem. People who are looking for results are fear tracking there in the back of their brain, because they're no longer trying to act like themselves. See, God calls us to act like ourselves whether it gets results or not. Wonderful the results it will get, actually, but that's not the point. So with counselors who are getting stuck, with people in church who are being stuck, people in spiritual warfare who are getting stuck, they are almost always gotten stuck on some point where they're trying to get results. They're in the back of the brain. Creativity is shut down. There's no longer any joy. They're no longer getting up in the front where there's good, hopeless despair and they can watch what God is doing. They are trying to avoid something. They're trying to make something stop. A good sign that you're in the back of your brain. Isn't this front and back of the brain kind of useful to think about? Because how often do I get stuck on wanting results? In fact, in a lot of conferences, I'm sure this conference will be an exception, a good percentage of the people who come up to talk to me afterwards are stuck on something and they want me to tell them how to get results. You see, this is a terrible thing for presenters, you know. We're supposed to get results on that? Why, that calls for hopeless despair. But suppose that we were people of God, here to see what he has got to do. We're relational people. There's freedom in that. There's who knows what's going to happen next. If you're in the front of the brain, you're concerned with truth. You're concerned with acting like yourself. What is it like us, the people of God, to do in this condition? So, what is it like us to do? Well, when we need to bond with people, the back of the Red Dragon Cast Down has a list of how identity change can be accomplished through replacing fear bonds with love bonds. And I'm going to read through these and just comment on them a little bit as we go along, because this is the bonding process we're talking about. At least to begin with, I will start by saying, oh, that'd be awful. I wouldn't like that a bit. Well, we've got a bond going here. At least this person cares enough about whether I'm going to kill myself that we got something in common. We're on the same page here. But now, if that's where we stay, by the time that we've been together in counseling for a while, they will, every time they need attention from me, have escalated the threat of killing themselves to more and more severe measures, you see. And if I'm trying to back away from that, I'm trying to act like I'm not worried about them killing themselves while they're acting more and more like, at least you're going to bond with me about this. Well, now I've got the gun, aren't you? Well, now, and, trying to fear bond, you see. At least you'd care about that. Well, that's the first connection, but that's not the place to start. The place to end. What we want to do next is to avoid them. And that is, they come and they overwhelm you with something in the hopes that that'll form some connection with you. And so they blow you away because they know that that'll make you think about them. That's a bond, you see. They'll get you worried. They basically blow you out by the size of their emotions. And that's not a good plan. Whenever someone begins to do that with you, the procedure to follow is you stay calm while the intense emotion is going on so that it's not producing any kind of, withdrawing or attention for them. And when it begins to subside, then you move closer. So if they're raging, yelling at you, you just stay there till they're, kind of getting done. You don't have to wait till it's all done, but they're starting to calm down. Then you move closer with them and begin to say, I'm glad to be with you. Some message that says, I want to help you with exactly what it is that you have going on there. But the bond begins to form when the emotion is subsiding, so that they realize it isn't intensifying this thing that makes them want to be with me. It's when I begin to gain control over these feelings and they begin to subside, they are able to help me then. They still want to be with me, they stayed with me, but it's when I'm gaining control that they want to really help me to really have that happen. And this is a marvelous technique if your joy strength is complete and you know how to return to joy from that emotion. Otherwise, you're going to be blown away yourself. So if you can't handle the heat, you know that you need to learn returning to joy or increase your joyful identity yourself, which is one of the first things that becomes obvious to most of us at some area, at some point in time, when we're being used by God to minister. And isn't that wonderful? Because that's where we're going to start growing. Those little deficits left in us are not going to be left ignored by God. He knows where they are, He'll dig them up. He'll send you the next person that'll expose that for you. Well, you add love bonds to the fear bonds until the fear bonds can be dropped. So as the love grows stronger, the need for fear bonding disappears. Because the Holy Spirit reveals that to you. You don't know what kind of a bond it is because you think it'd be a good idea, or because it seems to fit a formula of some kind. Holy Spirit is the only one that can say, here's the kind of bond that I am forming between you and that person. And I can tell you dreadful stories of people who've ignored that and did what they thought was a great idea. They're going to form some kind of a bond with the person. Normally they think, well, I'll be like your new parent here or something like that because you need somebody and so I'll help you along. And, these people are usually gifted in mercy, but low on wisdom. And they have forgotten that in being merciful, that it's a call for them to feel hopeless despair. So to avoid hopeless despair because they have no way to go with their mercy and wait for God to step in. They've stepped in themselves to try to avoid that. And so you have people who are trying to keep this situation from being hopeless by doing something about it themselves. And that's a disaster there. Because process when you're dealing with redemptive bonds. So you're going to expect that you're going to be bonding with them when you've joined them in the worst experiences that they have. You building some kind of a relationship between us. We are here because we're part of the redemptive community God has called. We're doing this because God is hopeful in this situation. We remind each other very often what these are. Probably I shouldn't have anything more to do with you because I messed up. Well, there's no return to joy right there, is there? There's no way that even though something went wrong, we can be glad to be together. But our path that we're following is one of returning to joy. If God has established a bond, then it's up to Him to help us return to joy if something went wrong. And we repent, we let God work through that. But we know where He's taking us. He's taking us back to joy, being glad to be together. We establish in isolation. He calls us to be part of a community, and I find people who practice building redemptive bonds with people in isolation, just disasters waiting to happen. That is not the way that God intended to build community. So we look for other people. However aggravating the people of God may be, it's better to be aggravated by them than to be alone. You might help some of them return to joy. Then here we go. Expect redemptive bonds knows exactly how true that is in the fellowship around you, probably especially with your spouse. Use this time to purify your bonds and motives and clearly interpret the bond to the person you are bonding with as well as to the skeptics. Be very patient with them all. Remember, you're in a whole process of building something that God ordains, and unless He builds the house, we labor in vain to do it. It's not our doing. We ought to be in hopeless despair anytime we consider redemptive bonding. Of course it's too big. Of course it's too bad. This has got to be a God sort of a thing that's going on. And I'm glad you are. You hadn't been thinking that much about joy before. But joy, building joy and returning to joy, is equally the case with your spouse and family and those who are upset with you because of the ministry that you've ended up with. Teaching them about joy and returning to joy is also a ministry that God has gifted you with. And when you begin to look at the heartbreaking things that happen with you in relationships with the people close to you, you'll begin to make a very clear map of the places where these poor dear folks cannot get back to joy. How they do not know how to be relational, how they do not know how to be glad to be with us if we're about doing this and if we're doing that and if we're in relationship with that and if we heard and did said and all that sort of stuff, you see, it's an invitation to teach people how to return to joy. And how about the people in church? The ones who are just totally not happy with this. They don't want to hear about it. Well, is this not also a wide open invitation for those of us who are beginning to learn the life of joy and returning to joy, to begin to invite them back in and say, well, you need to see what God's doing here. I would be glad to have you. I would be glad to have your upset with me, because you've probably not experienced being upset with someone before who is going to be glad to be with you to see what God would do in the midst of that. So that we might all learn how to act like ourselves. So if it feels a little bit like God's made you into a lightning rod, well, he's getting your attention and the attention of the people around you. But what we've forgotten in that is that none of us are happy till we're all back in joy camp, where we're glad to be together. And when we can tell other people, yes, it was as bad as that, but I'm glad to be with God in the middle of that. And I'm glad to be with you. And I'm glad that if nothing else you can tell me that you're upset with me. Or I'm glad that if nothing else you could tell brother so-and-so that you're upset with me because you won't tell me directly. And at least you're glad to be with someone even if it isn't me. And I want to bless that. And I want us to become a fellowship where ultimately all of us are glad to be together. And you know what that'll be like? That'll be impossible. That's a call for hopeless despair because we could never do that. It would just be so unthinkable that I just can't imagine getting there, but I want the front row seat because I serve a God who can. Come with me. Thank you.